For 500 years, the formula for power in Europe was simple. Build your walls high, build them thick, and sit behind them. The medieval castle was the ultimate delete button for an invading army. If you had 50 feet of vertical stone, you were untouchable. But in the mid-1400s, that formula didn't just break, it exploded. The arrival of gunpowder and the mobile siege cannon turned the architectural world upside down. In 1453, the impenetrable walls of Constantinople, walls that had stood for a millennium, were turned into gravel by the Ottoman cannons in just weeks. Suddenly, the vertical wall wasn't a defense, it was a target. Imagine the panic in the courts of Italy and France. The kings realized that every castle they owned was now a decorative tomb. They needed a new logic. They needed a way to survive a weapon that could punch through stone from a mile away. What they invented wasn't just a building, it was a mathematical masterpiece that would dominate the globe for 300 years. This is the story of the Trace Italienne, the Star Fort. To truly understand the Star Fort, you have to understand the nightmare of 15th century ballistics. Before the cannon, a wall was just a shield. After the cannon, a wall became a liability. In the old world, a round tower was considered strong because it was hard to find a corner to chip away at. But a cannonball doesn't care about corners, it cares about energy transfer. When a 20-pound iron ball hits a flat stone surface at a 90-degree angle, the kinetic energy has nowhere to go but into the wall. This is what engineers call normal impact. It's the most destructive force in physics. The Star Fort solved this with the pointed bastion. By replacing round towers with sharp, diamond-shaped points, engineers ensured that a cannonball would almost always hit at a glancing angle, typically 30 to 45 degrees. Instead of exploding the stone, the ball would skip or ricochet off the surface like a stone skipping across a pond. You weren't trying to be stronger than the cannon, you were trying to be more slippery. But the real genius of the Star wasn't just in the walls, it was in the angles of vision. In a traditional square castle, if an enemy soldier made it to the base of the wall, the foot of the rampart, he was in what was known as the dead zone. The defenders at the top couldn't see him without leaning dangerously over the edge, leaving them vulnerable to archers or snipers. The Star Fort used the flanked angle. Because each point of the star projected outward, every single inch of the fortress wall was visible to a soldier standing on the neighboring bastion. If you tried to put a ladder against wall A, you were being shot in the back by a cannon on bastion B. There was no place to hide. The geometry turned the entire perimeter into a 360-degree kill zone. Every soldier was protected by the line of sight of his comrade. This is the first time in history that architecture wasn't just about holding a space, it was about controlling the air around it. Finally, look at the outer layers. The star didn't end at the wall. Engineers added ravelins, isolated triangular islands of stone in the middle of the moat. These functioned like speed bumps for an invading army. If you managed to capture a ravelin, you were still stuck in a ditch, trapped between the outer island and the main wall, with nowhere to go. It was a mathematical labyrinth designed to make the cost of every foot of ground so high in blood and gold that most generals would simply look at the fort and decide to turn around. In the 16th century, this was the ultimate deterrent technology. The Star Fort was the nuclear weapon of its day. Its mere existence was often enough to prevent a war from even starting. When we think of grand European architecture, we usually think of the marble of Rome or the limestone of the French chateau. But the Star Fort was different. It was a masterpiece of soil science. The engineers of the 16th and 17th centuries led by the brilliant French military mastermind Sébastien Louprest de Vourbon, discovered a terrifying truth about stone. Stone is brittle. When a 24-pound iron cannonball hits a stone wall, the wall doesn't just break, it shatters into thousands of tiny, jagged projectiles. In many medieval sieges, more soldiers were killed by flying stone than by the actual cannonballs. The solution was the rampart. Instead of building a wall of stone, they built a wall to hold earth. They would construct 2 thin retaining walls of brick or stone and fill the 20-foot gap between them with tightly packed moist clay and soil. Why soil? Because soil is a non-Newtonian defense. When a cannonball hits a massive bank of earth, the energy is absorbed and dissipated throughout the millions of tiny particles of dirt. The ball doesn't shatter the wall, it simply buries itself. The earth swallows the kinetic energy. In fact, a cannonball hit often made the wall stronger by further compacting the soil. But moving that much earth wasn't just a construction project, it was an economic earthquake. To build a standard star fort, you had to move millions of cubic meters of soil. We are talking about the equivalent of moving a small mountain 1 shovel at a time. This required a level of industrial organization that Europe hadn't seen since the Roman Empire. You needed the excavators, thousands of laborers digging the moat, the ditch, which provided the soil for the rampart, the wall, the engineers, who used trigonometry to ensure the slopes were exactly at the right angle, the glacis to deflect fire, the logistics officers, who had to feed, house, and pay this massive workforce for the 5 to 10 years it took to finish a single fort. This is where the politics of Europe changed forever. A local duke or count couldn't afford this. Only a centralized nation-state with a tax-collecting bureaucracy could fund a star fort. This led to the professionalism of war. Architecture was no longer a hobby for the elite. It was a state-run industry. Perhaps the most high IQ part of the star fort was the glacis. To a soldier attacking the fort, it looked like he was just running up a gentle, grassy hill toward a small wall. He couldn't see the massive cannons hidden behind the ramparts. This was a deliberate optical illusion. The glacis was a long, sloping bank of earth that served 2 purposes. 1, it completely hid the main stone walls from the enemy's horizontal cannon fire. 2, it forced the attacking infantry to run up a slope with absolutely no cover, directly into the mouths of the defenders' muskets. You were running up a hill that was mathematically designed to make you a perfect target. By the time you realized you were in the kill zone, it was too late. You weren't just fighting a fort, you were fighting a geometric trap designed as a landscape. When a star fort was finished, it created a geopolitical stalemate. It was so effective that generals realized a direct assault was no longer an option. It was a death sentence. War in Europe underwent a fundamental shift. It stopped being about the charge and started being about the cutter. If you couldn't go over the walls, you had to go under them or crawl toward them. This birthed a specialized class of soldiers known as sappers. Their job was to dig saps, deep trenches that led toward the fortress. But if you dug a straight trench, the defenders in the star fort could fire a cannonball straight down the line, clearing out hundreds of men in a single shot. This is called enfilade fire. To counter the geometry of the fort, the attackers had to use geometry of their own. They invented the zigzag trench. By digging at sharp angles, the attackers ensured that no defender could ever have a clear line of sight down the length of the trench. Every 20 yards, the trench turned. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the mud, moving only a few dozen meters a day. The legendary engineer Vauban perfected this into the system of 3 parallels. You dug a giant circle around the fort, then zigzagged inward to a second circle, then a third. It was like a slow-motion pincer movement made of dirt. The Star Fort turned war into a game of resource depletion. This is where we talk about the human cost. Inside the fort, you had 2,000 soldiers and 5,000 civilians. You had a fixed amount of grain, a fixed amount of gunpowder, and a fixed amount of water. Outside, the besieging army had 30,000 men, but they were exposed to the elements. This created a psychological timer. The defender was praying for a relief column, an allied army, to arrive and break the siege from the outside. The attacker was praying that the defender would run out of food before the attacker's own men died of typhus, dysentery, or scurvy. In 17th century warfare, more men died from camp fever than from bullets. The Star Fort was a weapon that used disease and hunger as its primary ammunition. If the fort could hold out for 6 months, the attacking army would simply melt away, destroyed by the microscopic enemies in their own water supply. Finally, we have to talk about the honor of the siege. Because these forts were so expensive and the men inside were so professional, there was a strange, gentlemanly code. Once the attackers' trenches reached the foot of the wall and they placed mines, explosive barrels, under the bastions, they would offer the defenders an honorable surrender. If the defenders surrendered then, they were allowed to march out with their flags flying and their weapons in hand. But if they refused and the walls were breached, the laws of war allowed the attackers to sack the city and kill everyone inside. The Star Fort wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a diplomatic lever. It forced commanders to make cold, calculated decisions about the value of human life versus the value of a stone point on a map. Eventually, the Star Fort met the same fate as the medieval castle. In the mid-1800s, rifled artillery was invented. These new cannons could fire shells that spun like a football, giving them incredible accuracy and the power to pierce even the thickest earthworks. Suddenly, the beautiful geometric stars were obsolete. But look at a map of a city like Paris, Copenhagen, or even New York's Liberty Island. You will see the jagged, star-shaped ghosts of these fortresses hidden in the city streets. They represent a time when humanity tried to use perfect geometry to solve the problem of total war. They are a reminder that in the face of destruction, our own instinct is to find a mathematical pattern that can protect us.